Hello everybody, I am Tom and you are watching my guide / theorycraft video about Larian Studios' upcoming Baldur's Gate 3. So we don't know a whole lot about the upcoming game, and also the rather overdue game of the Baldur's Gate series, but what we have been told, however, is that Larian is trying to stay as close as practical to the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons rule set. This includes a switch from real-time with pause of the historic Baldur's Gate games to a turn-based system more like Larian's previous Divinity Original Sin, as well as the tabletop game. The tabletop game obviously is turn-based, so it's going actually even closer to what you would expect from a D&D game. But since we know how close the tabletop rules Larian is trying to aim for, I feel pretty confident in doing some speculative guides about some aspects of the game. Emphasis there specifically on speculative. All of this is subject to change by Larian. Probably, I think some things are going to be changed just to better fit a video game context, but there's other things they may just change for creative reasons. I plan to do a bunch of guides on each of the classes that are going to be available in Baldur's Gate 3, but I think what is probably necessary before I do that is a precursor for the basics of the rule set of D&D 5e, precisely because there's going to be a lot of people where, when I'm describing how a class works, there's some background knowledge that is necessary to actually understand that. So I'm making this video first so I can refer people back to it if they need to understand the minutiae of D&D rules. But as such, today's video is just the basics, so if you're familiar with the tabletop game, this is probably going to be relatively useful for you. And to a lesser extent, even if you're familiar with the previous Baldur's Gate games, it's also less relevant. The previous Baldur's Gate games were based on a previous rule set of D&D, not 5th edition, but if you understand the previous ones, it's probably relatively easy to understand the new one that's coming out. So this is going to be a very basic guide for people who have no experience in D&D and no experience in Baldur's Gate, essentially. So the first and arguably most important thing to know about D&D, and by extension Baldur's Gate 3, from here on I'll probably just call it BG3, is that most everything is decided off the roll of a dice. The most prominent of which is the 20-sided dice, or D20, and for clarification, further in the video, if I say D followed by a number, it's referring to a die with that number of sides, i.e. a D8 is an 8-sided die. Now, from jumping a gorge to loosing an arrow, all the way to talking away past a guard, all of these things are ultimately determined by the roll of a dice. Depending on how you've built your character, will kind of roll into how much you get a modifier on how good or bad you are at a particular thing, but it always rolls down to the roll of a dice for the most part. As an example, a rogue is likely going to be built so that they're easier to sneak past an enemy encampment than a fighter would have. Equally, a fighter that's wearing heavy armor is going to be much harder to damage in combat than a mage who's wearing nothing but robes. But from then, we can go on to how to actually create a character. There are likely going to be 4 main steps in creating a character in Baldur's Gate 3, and we'll go through them one by one right now. First off, you're going to be selecting a race. There are many different fantasy races in the world of Faerun, which is where Baldur's Gate 3 is set. Some are rather standard, kind of Tolkien-esque fantasy, such as humans, elves, dwarves, etc. However, there are actually some more original and kind of out-there races like the Githyanki, which are like telepathic denizens of the astral plane. But all of them you can choose from, so there is a very large variety of races you can choose from. There is, however, some direct gameplay benefits that you get from choosing a particular race over another, other than just the aesthetic changes you get. Firstly, there are racial traits that can come in handy while you're exploring. Some of these count like special senses, like some have dark vision so they can see in the dark, others have a natural resistance to poison, those kind of things. You'll likely also get a language specific to your race. For instance, if you play as a Dragonborn, which are kind of like dragon humanoids, then you'll be able to read, speak, and write Draconic. Beyond that, it's also likely that you'll get some proficiencies for certain weapons and tools. I'll go into what this means specifically a little later in the video, but for simplicity, if your character is proficient in something, as the name suggests, you're better than the average person while using or doing it. And finally, your race will determine a few bumps to your primary stats. Again, I'll go over how the stats work a little later, but as a quick example, if you choose to play as a halfling, you get +2 to your dexterity score, and depending on your sub-race, you get a +1 to either charisma or constitution. So, as I've just stated there are sub-races as well, so not necessarily every race, but pretty much all races, you have a race and then a sub-race. So, there's some variation even within a specific race. After you've selected your race, you then go on to select a class. There are many classes available in Baldur's Gate 3. It's been confirmed that all the classes in the base 5th edition Player's Handbook are in the game, which is quite a lot to begin with. They've also said that they're looking at other sources as well, so there could be even more. But at the launch of the game, they're definitely going to have all of the classes from the 5th edition Player's Handbook. I'm planning on doing this, as I said earlier, I'm planning on doing a series on all of these classes and kind of a breakdown on what they do, and how they fit into the game and what kind of playstyle they do. But your class is really what sets you apart, or rather sets a specific character apart from all the others, is what their class is. Certainly in the most profound way. Mechanically, it will determine what skills and spells you can cast, what proficiencies you have with what armor and what weapons, all that kind of stuff. So it's probably the most important part about your character, I would say. It's what differentiates it the most. But as I said, I'm going to do a series going into the classes individually, so I won't touch too much on it here. Just know that your class is kind of like the main thing that will identify your character, which isn't entirely surprising. A lot of games are like that. And you will have a multitude of choices in Baldur's Gate 3. There's going to be quite a few. But after you've selected your race and your class, you go on to determining your stats. Now, your statistics, or ability scores, in Baldur's Gate 3 are split into 6 distinct abilities. You have Strength, Dexterity, Constitution, Wisdom, Intelligence, and Charisma. Each class is going to use one or two of these scores primarily, as its most important score. In my class videos, I'll go through this more specifically, but for now, I'll explain the basis of what each of these are. Firstly, you have Strength, somewhat self-explanatory. It determines how much you can carry, how easily and how hard you can hit with strength-based weapons, like swords, great swords, axes, kind of melee weapons, essentially. Dexterity is equally rather ubiquitous in video gaming. Most people know what it is, but it's a stat that describes how lithe and agile your character is, and mechanically it also determines how effective your ranged combat is, as well as dexterity-based melee weapons, which are essentially small weapons like daggers or rapiers, things that kind of you associate more with finesse-type attacks. Next, we have Constitution, and this is ultimately the stat that determines how much HP you have. However, it also goes into other things, such as how long you can hold your breath, or if you can shrug off the effects of poisons or alcohol, that kind of thing. Next is Wisdom, and Wisdom is the score that I see most people getting confused with, particularly not quite understanding the difference between Wisdom and Intelligence. Wisdom is a combination of your attentiveness and your kind of common knowledge and common sense. Meanwhile, Intelligence is more akin to book knowledge and memory. The rather apt metaphor of the tomato really works here, that intelligence is knowing that a tomato is indeed a fruit, whereas wisdom is having the knowledge that you should nevertheless not put it into a fruit salad. And then finally we have Charisma, and this is kind of your force of personality. So the silver-tongued bard, or the intimidating half-orc barbarian, it allows you to influence the people around you through persuasion or intimidation or deception, and it's kind of just your force of presence. And after you've done your stat determination, your class, and your race, finally you pick your background, which is essentially where you came from before you went to set out to become an adventurer. Whether you're a soldier in the Royal Military or a street urchin stealing to survive in the city of Baldur's Gate, these help you kind of flesh out your character, but they also give you mechanical benefits such as certain proficiencies. Again, I'll go into proficiencies a little later. But they also give you, say, a contact from your previous lives that may be able to help you in your adventure. I'm interested to see how Baldur's Gate actually implements these specifically into the game, because there's some of them that are interesting to be able to put into a video game context, and I'm interested to see how well they do it. And with that, that's pretty much character creation complete. So we can move on to the gameplay of Baldur's Gate 3. The gameplay of BG3 will be largely familiar to those who've played isometric RPGs in the past, particularly to the Divinity Original Sin game, which is previously made by Larian Studios. The notable similarities there are kind of exploring the world, talking to NPCs, picking up quests, doing the objectives along the way. Where Baldur's Gate 3 I think deviates from a lot of games is in its combat, because it follows Dungeons & Dragons particularly closely, and specifically the 5th edition rule set. And I can kind of go into how this all works now. Firstly, the game is turn-based. This allows for the most strategic maneuverability and control over your characters. And one notable difference between D&D and Baldur's Gate is that Larian, at this stage at least, has opted for a team versus team initiative order rather than individual character-based ones. I think this was made to make co-op go a bit more streamlined and for combination attacks to be used more effectively. But essentially, everyone on your team gets to go, and then everyone on the opposing team gets to go, and you take turns. Classically in D&D, each character would have a point in the initiative order where they would go. So it could be one of your characters, then one of the enemies, then another of the enemies, then another of your characters, and it kind of went like that. So they've changed that a bit from base D&D, and I'm interested to see how that works. I think definitely it will make co-op much nicer, because it will allow you... There's one problem with Divinity Original Sin, was that when you were playing co-op, combat could take a very long time, because if you had someone trying to figure out what they wanted to do, then you'd have to wait for them to finish, and then it'd go into the next player, and they'd have to wait for them to figure out what to do. Whereas if all the real-life players can make their decisions at the same time, it should make things quite a bit easier, or at least quite a bit quicker. But each character on their respective turns has 3 possible things they can do. You have an action, a bonus action, and movement. The most obvious and most common example of an action is an attack or a spell. A bonus action is... they're more specific, and it'll depend a lot on your character and class on how many bonus actions you have access to. But there are some spells that are bonus actions, as well as little actions that you can do like, I don't know, reaching and picking up an item, things like that. And finally, each character has a speed, measured in feet, that corresponds to how far they can move in one round of combat. I think the average is about 30 feet, depending mainly on race, but class can affect your speed as well. Like bigger creatures usually have 35 or 40 feet, and smaller creatures have like 25. But 30 I think is the average for humans and most human-sized races. If we move on to actually attacking, when you make an attack, a d20 is rolled, and you need to, after all the appropriate modifiers are applied, hit a number at or higher than the armor class of the enemy that you're attacking. I won't go precisely into how the armor class is determined, because helpfully, Baldur's Gate 3, Larian has kind of converted all of this just into a straight percentage. You can just hover over an enemy and it will say 95% chance to hit, so you don't really have to worry about the rolling, that all happens in the background. The only notable thing about the dice is that if you roll a 20 on the roll, then you get a critical hit, which means you double the damage of all the dice rolled for your attack. But again, as far as Baldur's Gate 3 goes, this is all kind of done behind the curtain, so you don't really have to worry about it much. Essentially, you'll be able to have a percentage chance of hitting an enemy when you attack them. That's pretty much it. As for attacking with spells, some of these are the same as just attacking with a weapon where it's a d20 rolled. However, most rely on the opponent to make a saving throw. This is when the opponent rolls a d20 and adds the modifier for the corresponding statistic. Being successful either nullifies or at the very least lessens the detrimental effect. As an example, if an enemy uses a fireball spell, there's a 20-foot radius area in which everyone must make a dexterity saving throw and try and get out of the way. On a failed save, you suffer 8d6 fire damage, but if you succeed on the save, you only take half the amount of damage, which is quite a lot of damage. Fireball is a pretty powerful spell, at least for kind of low to mid-range play in Dungeons & Dragons. And finally, what we need to talk about is if one of your characters gets knocked down to 0 HP. Contrary to what the conventional wisdom might be, this isn't the death of a character. They're simply knocked unconscious. They can be revived with healing magic or a potion, for example. But each round of combat that they're unconscious, they must make a death saving throw. This is just a straight d20 roll with a 10 or higher being success, and below, that's a failure. 3 successful saves and you'll be stabilized and your character will be out of immediate danger. But if you get 3 fails, your character is just truly dead. What's interesting is that D&D does have quite a few ways to revive the dead, but it remains to be seen whether Baldur's Gate 3 is going to have these options easily accessible or not. It is worth noting that an unconscious character can still be attacked, and if they are, then they immediately fail 2 death saving throws. So, if your character goes down, it is best to draw attention away from their body as soon as possible. Now, the final thing I want to talk about in this basics guide is skills, tools, and proficiencies. Tools are somewhat self-explanatory, although they do have more specific things in practice in the actual game, but they encompass musical instruments, thieves' tools, a woodworking set. They're tools, or more accurately sets of tools, that are useful for a specific job or task. If you are proficient in woodworking tools, however, for instance, you may be able to use them to fix a cart. You could use them to do something that is directly related to what the tool is useful for. The more specific one is thieves' tools. It's probably used the most often because that is essentially a lockpicking set. It's used to be able to pick locks and get through doors that are locked. Very useful for a rogue, and I think all rogues come by default with a proficiency in thieves' tools. Moving on from there, we have skills. In D&D, and thereby in Baldur's Gate 3, there is a secondary level of your character customization. Some examples of these would be persuasion or athletics or animal handling. They're used almost exclusively out of combat, and they're what determines how likely you are to succeed at a given task. All characters can attempt a check with any skill, however if a character is proficient with a skill then they gain a bonus to their modifier when they attempt to do it. For instance, if you're trying to convince your way past a guard, if you have proficiency in persuasion, it's going to be a lot easier than one of your other characters who isn't proficient in persuasion. It's also, persuasion is a charisma based skill, so if you're more charismatic, it also helps on top of that. Proficiencies, there is a straight number bonus that will be given to you as you level up, and that is added to anything in which you are proficient, including weapons and armor. So if you make an attack with a sword you're proficient with, you have a higher chance to hit and do more damage than if you were using a great axe that you're not proficient with. So it's always good to use items and skills that you're proficient with in order to have your characters be as efficient as possible. And with that, I feel like I've adequately set up a primer for the basics of the gameplay in Baldur's Gate. If there's any questions, ask them down in the comments. And as far as I know, this will now be a pretty good fallback for people. If there's any misunderstandings in my upcoming class videos, I can just kind of reference them back to this video. That's my hope anyway. But if you like the video, please leave a like. If you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing. I'll be doing more Baldur's Gate stuff in the future. And as always, thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time. And once again, any questions about things that I inadequately covered or you didn't understand about the video, please leave in the comments and I'll try and answer them as best as I can. Thanks guys.